Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me again today for a Bible study through another chapter of the Bible. Today, 1 Kings chapter 20. We're getting to the end of 1 Kings, talking about Elijah. And the king over Israel during that time was King Ahab. Specifically, we're talking about a period of time that probably happened somewhere between 920 and 890 BC. As far as our key characters, we've got Ahab, who was the king of Israel, the northern part of God's people. We've got Ben-hadad. He was the king of Syria. Syria is up to the north even of Israel. And then a prophet of God. We don't know his name. This man delivered a message of punishment against Ahab after his battle with the Syrians. That's what we're going to be talking about in the outline section. So now to our map. The first location is actually just north of where our map ends, north of the land of Israel, and it's the kingdom of Syria. They were Israel's northern neighbors. Israel's capital was at Samaria, which that one is on the map, and the Syrian soldiers fled from the battle and they went to Aphek after being routed by the Israelite army. Aphek is at the very northern part of the territory of Ephraim. There are 43 verses in this chapter. It's quite a long chapter, so let's get into our outline as quickly as possible. Verses 1 through 12 is our first section. Ahab, the king of Israel, rejects the request of the king of Syria, and this causes a war. So Ben-hadad, the king of Syria, he had a confederation of 32 kings, and they came and attacked Samaria. Ben-hadad sent messengers to King Ahab in Samaria, and he said, "Ahab, everything that you own is mine." Right? Basically saying, yeah, I'm more powerful than you are. And he then later on said, I'm going to send men into your city, and we're basically just going to take everything that we want. Everything of value, we're going to spoil the city and take it as our own. Well, when Ben-hadad said this, Ahab had enough. He's like, no, you're not going to do this. He didn't allow Ben-hadad to proceed. And because of his refusal, Ben-hadad and the Syrian conglomerate of kings prepared their men to wage war on Samaria. This chapter actually records two battles between the Syrians and the Israelites, and we're going to talk about the first one in verses 13 through 22. God promised Ahab and Israel that he would allow them to win this battle, even though their army was significantly smaller. Ahab was to instigate the battle, and he attacked when Ben-hadad and his men were drinking. They defeated Ben-hadad's army, but the king, Ben-hadad, escaped on a horse. The text says that Israel, quote, struck the horses and chariots and struck the Syrians with a great blow in verse 21. Now, a prophet of God warned Ahab that the Syrians were going to return in the spring after regrouping their forces. So that leads us into the second battle in the next section. Verses 23 through 34, Ahab's second battle with the Syrians. Ben-hadad's advisors counseled him that the reason that he had lost the battle was because the God of Israel was a God of the hills. They advised him to rebuild his army and then to attack, but to make sure that he was fighting on the plains. So that's what they did. They all got in their planes and they flew to Samaria. Oh, wait, no. The other plains, like flat land. Not in the hills. Fight in the plains. Ben-hadad thought that this was pretty good advice, and so he did as his advisors told him, and he brought his new army to Israel in the spring. The Syrians are said to have filled the country. There's tons and tons of them. In contrast, the Israelites were said to be like two little flocks of goats. But God again promised Ahab and Israel that they would be victorious. He was going to prove that his lordship wasn't just over the hills, but it was over the plains and it was over everywhere else. God didn't like the fact that the Syrian advisors had thought that he was just a regional deity who only had limited jurisdiction. Israel during the battle killed 100,000 Syrians, and 27,000 more were killed when the walls of the city of Aphek fell on them. And that was perhaps a miraculous incident. After the battle, though, Ahab made a mistake. He made a covenant with the king of Syria. He let him live and return to his home. This leads us into our final section, verses 35 through 43. A prophet condemns Ahab for allowing Ben-hadad to live. So the scene here shifts from the battlefield, Ahab and the Israelites and the Syrians, to a prophet of God who makes a really interesting request of some men that he meets. So let's talk about this guy. We don't know his name. He was a prophet, right? That's about all we know. This prophet went up to a man, and he told this man to hit him, to strike him, hit him in the face, basically, because the Lord wanted this to be done. Now, the man refused to do it. He didn't want to hit the prophet. And the prophet told him that because he had refused to do what the Lord wanted him to do, he was going to be killed by a lion for disobeying God. Okay, pretty interesting. The prophet then found another man and he repeated the instruction. He said, "Hit me in the face." And this time, the man hit him and injured him. Our newly injured prophet now bandaged up his eye and he sat in the road waiting for King Ahab to come by. When King Ahab came by, he had this interesting story for King Ahab. He said that he was a man who had been entrusted with keeping guard over another man, perhaps a prisoner, right? And he was supposed to do this job, and he was told that if he failed to do the job of keeping track of this guy, he was going to be killed for it. Well, he told Ahab that the guy he was supposed to be guarding had escaped. And so Ahab responded and he said, "Well, then you deserve to die because you failed to do your job." So why did the prophet have this strange story? Well, it's because his story parallels what Ahab had just done. The prophet took off the bandage that was on his eye. Ahab recognizes him as a prophet, and the prophet condemns Ahab for what he had just done by letting Ben-hadad go. God had entrusted Ahab with destroying Ben-hadad, but Ahab had failed, and he had made a covenant with him, and he had let him go back to his country. Because of this, God was going to require Ahab's life as punishment. So that's 1 Kings chapter 20. We will talk about what happens to Ahab in upcoming chapters, but let's talk about our application for now. We are not in a position to extend grace or pardon to the enemies of God. Ahab he did not have the right to extend grace and pardon to Ben-hadad. But what does that look like in the modern day? Unfortunately, many people who claim the name of Christ speak in contradiction to the laws of God, excusing and pardoning people whom the Word of God condemns, justifying people in their sins, basically handing out pardons where God says there's going to be judgment. Those who reject God's instructions and blaspheme him are enemies of God, according to Romans chapter 5, verse 10. Just like Ben-hadad was an enemy of God, deserving of punishment, God's justice is going to fall on his enemies. The last thing that we want to be found doing when that judgment comes is pacifying people, telling people that their lifestyles are all right, supporting people who live in sin, basically handing out pardons where God says judgment is going to be executed.